Hi, I'm Dr. Selena Fisk, and welcome to this episode of Make Data Talk. In this podcast, I help you turn your spreadsheets into stories in a way that is practical, accessible, and hopefully a whole lot more useful than your grade 9 maths textbook. I'm coming off the back of delivering a brand new keynote of mine. It was pretty awesome. It was a lot of fun. It was a big room of people. But I reckon it was actually not just the topic I was talking about. It was the context I was kind of framing it in that just made it so much fun. So I framed this whole keynote and discussion about impact through, I guess, football. And so this episode today, I'm going to just touch on a few of the points that I made in that keynote, because measuring impact is something that we want to be able to do. We want to be able to talk about the impact that we've had, that our change processes have had, what impact it's had on, the culture and the people in our teams, the clients, the people we aim to serve, but also the processes as well. And it's even though it's something we want to be able to do, it's not easy. The keynote is titled, How Do You Know Your Impact? And I delivered this keynote for the first time 3 days after my beloved Brisbane Lions won the AFL Premiership. So for those internationally, the Lions play in the Australian Rules Football League, and it's a bit of a religion in Australia. And I got to go to the grand final and we won, and it was absolutely majestic. And it's been 21 years in between premierships. So it was awesome to be at. It's the first premiership game I've ever been at. The Brisbane Lions got a new coach about 8 years ago. His name's Chris Fagan. And if you think about how you measure the impact of this man and the impact he's had on the football players and the football club, there's a lot of different ways that we could consider his impact. On the day, one of the things I love about watching footy now is the ability to watch all the stats live in the AFL app. And I was having a conversation recently with somebody where we were saying, 20 years ago when we were watching football, these stats were being taken, but they were being taken by somebody on the edge of the field. And now we have them readily available to us, and you can watch it in real time live on the app, which is pretty cool. So when you think about the impact of this coach, you could think about the stats that we could see through the game. One of the key indicators of success in AFL is the number of marks that a team makes. And there's a bit of a threshold of about 100 marks. And so leading into the game, two teams kind of at their peak, both playing really great footy. One of the kind of KPIs, if you like, was that people were saying, well, look, whichever team gets to 100 marks or more is probably going to win the premiership. So that's certainly something that statistically you could watch throughout the game. You can certainly look at how many marks inside 50. You can look at the number of contested possessions. You can look at disposals. There are so many different types of quantitative data that are available in that app. When you think about the impact of this coach, do you think about the fact that he has taken them from a context where they won 7 games across 2 whole seasons? The first year he coached them, they got the wooden spoon in the competition. So is his impact that he's taken them from the wooden spoon through to premiership? Maybe it is. Maybe that's the best kind of metric or indicator of his impact. The really interesting thing about Chris Fagan as well is thinking about the fact that he's actually the oldest coach to win a premiership in the AFL. So he's about 6 years older than the next youngest, the next oldest, which is pretty cool to be able to achieve something like that. But really interestingly, he's actually proven, because he's the first person to have done it, that you don't have to have played AFL at the highest level to know the game well enough to coach a team to success. So he's the first coach to win a premiership who hasn't played senior football in the AFL or VFL. So you can think about quantitatively what he's done for this team and how they performed on the day. The Lions beat the Sydney Swans. Sorry, not sorry to any Sydney supporters listening, but you could look at the fact that the Lions actually doubled the score of the Sydney Swans on the day. So not only did they win, but it was a convincing win. They played beautiful footy, and I need to probably stop talking and banging on about how great it was, but it was. But there are so many different ways that we could consider his impact as a coach. You could think about what some of his players have said about him and the way that they reflect on his impacts. Like, the captain, Lachie Neale, has talked about the fact that he believes in his players. He sells this big picture of what's possible and how you show up and the contribution you make. And it makes people feel really special. Others have said, that it's the fact that he just instills this belief in the group. He loves Ted Lasso, and he has this, he had like the Believe sign. Believe has been the theme for the entire season. So they kind of always have a bit of a catchphrase or, a tagline for the season. And this year it was Believe. And it's just really nice that he's kind of making that nod to, giving that nod to Ted Lasso, but he's just built this culture off the field that, has meant that these players have absolutely believed in what they were capable of. And they actually played in the grand final 12 months ago and lost. And I was at that game as well. And it was really interesting to watch much the same team on the field, just playing this year with so much more conviction. And so I could see from the stands the belief that these players had in their own ability. Really hard to actually quantify or tangibly discuss impact of anybody. And I use the example of Chris Fagan, and even if you're not an AFL supporter, I use this example because of how difficult it is. I'm trying to illustrate how hard it is to talk about the impacts that we've had or that a change process has had. Sometimes, rarely, but sometimes it might be that you implement something that has a very clear output or impact on another metric. If that's the case, then you're living in a world where it's probably manufacturing related, but it's a very clear black box process where there's an input, something happens within kind of the black box, and then there's an output. And in those kind of mechanistic systems, if we want to be able to change the output and the input is the same, then we just make a tweak to the black box and then the output will improve or change as a result. But in reality, most of us work and live in industries where we are working in the grey. We're dealing with complex human beings, in complex systems. So it's never going to be as simple as making a small tweak and being able to really clearly kind of see the change. So one of the things, I guess, that I think is really important to consider when we consider impact is that we're considering it from multiple perspectives. So I've just rattled off to you a whole lot of different examples of the way that Chris Fagan has had an impact at the Brisbane Lions. Some of those are statistical. Some of those are the stats from the game on the day. Some of them are contextual, so information about where the club was, what's unique about him. Some of those were the perceptions of people that he works with day in, day out. And actually, without any of those pieces, and I've just scratched the surface, but without any of those pieces, the story of his impact would not be complete. In a previous episode, I talked about the importance of triangulation, and that's where we look at 3 or more sources of information to inform the decisions that we make. When we're talking about impact and reflecting on impact, we absolutely also need to be triangulating. We need to be thinking about what are 3 or more sources that indicate whether or not this thing worked. And how do we know how well it worked or how significant the impact was? So for Fagan, drawing on the quantitative and the qualitative can really build out this beautiful picture and an understanding of what he's done for the Brisbane Lions. The thing that I, talk about in that episode about the qualitative and quantitative data earlier in the podcast was that the quantitative data is great because it allows us to compare. So we can look at the 100 marks, for example, and we can go, okay, well, the Lions got to that 100 mark point in the third quarter on that day. So we kind of knew statistically that we were in a very good position. The score was also great. And so it gives us some stuff to easily compare. It's easy to look at it in the AFL app. But in the episode previously, I discussed the fact that the quantitative data doesn't actually give us the why. It doesn't give us the heart stuff. It doesn't talk about the interpersonal relationships. It doesn't talk about the culture. It doesn't talk about the relationships that he's built and the conviction and belief that he's created in that team. And so we can't just look at the quantitative in isolation. We absolutely have to be looking at the qualitative. And one of the things I think that's really interesting, so in the same week as the premiership game in the grand final, the Brownlow Medal is awarded, and the Brownlow Medal is awarded on the Monday night prior to the grand final. And the Brownlow is a combination of umpires' scores throughout the season. So for every single game that is umpired, players are given 3-2-1 points based on, the umpire's perception of the people who are the best on ground. So it's the highest individual honour in the AFL, and it's awarded, as I say, on the Monday before the grand final. And it's really interesting this year Paddy Cripps from Carlton, great player, great human. He won the Brownlow. And so this conversation about qualitative and quantitative data and what we should be using has really kind of come into the discussion this year about the Brownlow. Paddy Cripps won the Brownlow this year with 45 votes out of a possible 69. And that is the highest on record. He beat the previous highest record by 9 votes, which is absolutely extraordinary. And it's really interesting because there's been some criticism of the umpire's decisions about the points, not of Paddy Cripps, because he's an absolute legend, but questions about, I guess, mistakes that regular punters have assumed that the umpires have made, because what they've done is they've pulled out some of the stats of the people who are statistically best on ground, and they've said, well, look, statistically, he wasn't best on ground on that day. He was given 3 points, and, people who, weren't on the ground, maybe weren't there live, have some pretty vocal opinions about whether or not he deserved all of the sets of 3 points that he got at the different times. Now, the reason I bring that up now is because, again, Paddy Cripps' impact in a game is not just determined by those quantitative stats. And the Brownlow has always been, the impact has been judged by the umpire's perception of what's been happening on the ground. It's not right or wrong, but as we know, any qualitative data like that, any perceptions data, is the most subjective information we have. And that's okay. In this context, in the Brownlow, it is what it is. It's such a big part of the game. It's such an important part of the history of the AFL. So where there are people calling for umpires to have access to the quantitative data to help make their decisions, purists and traditionalists are saying, well, no, because we've never done that before. We want this to be based on individual experience and perception. And I think that that's okay in that context because of the history. But in our day-to-day work, we absolutely need to be bringing the two things together. We need to be drawing the qualitative and the quantitative together and making an overall judgment of impact based on what we see from multiple measures. A second example of that is Will Ashcroft, who on the grand final day, he won the Norm Smith medal, and the Norm Smith is given to the best on ground during the grand final. And my friend and I, as I say, we were there, and we were having a bit of a riff in between us about who we think is getting the Norm Smith, and we were rattling off a few different names. Kai Lohmann is one of my favourites. He had a stellar first half. So I was kind of thinking that maybe it was going to be him. Lachie Neale was in everything. Like Dane Zorko was incredible. And we were kind of just rattling off a few names. And to be honest, in our discussion, Will Ashcroft didn't actually come up as one of the people that was probably in our top 3. And then we started to look at the AFL app, and the AFL app does kind of AFL fantasy points, and it combines the number of quantitative metrics together to give an overall kind of score of impact on the field. And really interestingly, Will Ashcroft, who won the Norm Smith on the day, he was the 4th highest in that list. So statistically and quantitatively, he was the 4th best on ground. But obviously, from what the umpires saw, he wasn't. He was absolutely best on ground. It's really interesting where our perceptions of somebody's impact is absolutely influenced. Like in any use of data, it's influenced by who we are and how we see the world, not the world as it actually is. And we know how much our beliefs and perceptions are shaped by and influenced by different biases, a whole host of different biases. But it was really interesting. So after the grand final, Kate, my mate and I that went to the grand final with me, we went, came back to my place, as you do after a grand final, after a grand final win, you eat a pizza and you watch the replay. And watching the replay and listening to the commentary, it was immediately obvious how impactful Will Ashcroft had been on that game. And it was just that where we were sitting, the perception we had without the commentary, we have confirmation bias where I'm just looking for Kai Lohmann at every available opportunity. My mate looks at, Zach Bailey. Every time Zach's got a touch, he's like, yes, he's amazing. But, what we kind of realized and we could see very clearly from a different perspective was how impactful he is. I guess the main takeaway that I'd really like to leave you with from this episode today, there's kind of 2 parts. Whenever we think about impact, we've got to make a cumulative judgment drawing on multiple measures of information, qualitative and quantitative, including perceptions. And it's not until we can really kind of harness and triangulate across all of those data sets that we can definitively say, look, this person was the most impactful. This was the impact that they had, or this was the impact that they didn't have on the day or during the change process or in leading that team. But the final thing I'd like you to think about from this quantitative, qualitative perception is that your actions are not your impact. The actions you take, the work you do, the things you do, the tick boxes you check off, the possessions you get, the disposals you get, the marks you take, they're important, but they are not your impact. Your actions lead to the impact that you have, and they are necessary. They're a really important part of what we do and why we do it. You've got to get the actions done, but ultimately those actions will be what leads to the impact. They are not the impact themselves. So this has ended up being a little bit of a longer episode because I've just totally got into AFL and talking about, Fagan, Cripsey and Will Ashcroft. Absolute legends, all three of them. But I hope this episode today has got you thinking about how do you consider your impact and what are those metrics and the types of data that you collect to ascertain the influence that those actions you've taken have had on your team and your people. As always, stay safe and look after yourself.